All right, so Mick, I wanted to start off with the fact that I reviewed your book, Escaping the Rabbit
Mm,
Hole, and I thought it was really, really well written, for one. I thought the
thank
way,
you.
yeah, I thought the way you communicated in that was just really, really good. Definitely recommend people grabbing the book. I also, in the book, you talk about the fact that you're a man who thinks the truth is important and you enjoy finding it. So we certainly have that in common. Um, you open the book with a list of actual conspiracies that are actually true, right? And I'm wondering if there's any of those. Do one of them sort of stand out to you as being personally more interesting than maybe some of the other ones?
Oh, that's an interesting question because the one that always leaps to mind here is one that I heard about on, I think it was This American Life, which is a NPR radio show. And it was just the Archer Daniels Midland food company fixing the prices of some kind of feed additive, which is the most banal conspiracy you can imagine, but it's something that happens all the time. And it's something that a lot of people find, essentially unsurprising. But when you look behind how it actually works, it's kind of very interesting that these things are going on. That this company was having secret meetings in Hawaii with their Japanese counterparts to conspire to fix this particular price. Now, it's not as interesting as like, was the moon landing faked or something like that. But this was a real conspiracy, and looking at real conspiracies, I think, really gives you a good perspective on what it would take to actually pull off, a far more complicated conspiracy. A few guys fixing the price of something to make millions of dollars is one thing, but faking something completely outrageous, like the whole chemtrails thing, or even like the vaccine cover-ups, which is something on another order of magnitude higher up. So yeah, that's the one that always springs to mind as a good example for people to start thinking about what real conspiracies actually are.
That's interesting you bring that one up because in your introduction, all the other conspiracies I had pretty much heard of, and that was one I didn't. I thought, well, that's kind of almost a strange one to include in that list. So, how were they fixing the prices? Just like really quickly, how was that working in that
Well,
situation?
essentially, there should be competition between these different manufacturers of this particular thing. If there was competition, then the price would be driven down by the market, and all they would do really is they would just agree between themselves what price they were going to charge. So basically a secret cartel, which is an illegal organization that fixes the price of things. Like there used to be cartels for oil, where people would fix the price of oil and everyone would have to pay the same price. It was just removing the aspect of competition from the free market. So it's not really very complicated. And I think the reason the reason I particularly found it interesting was just because I listened to it on a road trip once. It was a 1 hour episode, and the story of how the FBI tracked it down was kind of a fascinating story. But
Interesting.
it is, it is like you say, it's kind of a boring conspiracy that people might not have heard of because it's not really that of an interesting topic. The price of feed additives.
Right. Yeah. Feed isn't really something that people get excited about. But
No.
let's talk about something that is exciting a lot of people right now, and it's very relevant, and that's this conspiracy of election fraud in the 2020 election. So I think you've been doing a lot of work around this. I know a lot of major news channels have been doing a lot of work. It's in all the news. I mean, it's definitely mainstream. What have you found, or what's interesting that you can share about this?
Well, what I've been focusing on is some of the claims of statistical aberrations or statistical abnormalities in the election results. And I think this is a very easy area for people to use essentially what's called an argument from authority, where someone says, like, I've got a PhD in mathematics, I've done this analysis, and here's a graph, and therefore I've detected fraud. And then the vast majority of people have no idea what these graphs mean. and they've no really idea what the underlying numbers mean, and they certainly have no idea what the analysis of this person is saying actually is. And so they just go along with, oh, we've found evidence of fraud. Look at this: thousands of votes have been cast for Biden when they should have been for Trump, and this guy has this graph that shows it, and he points an arrow to a bit of the graph that supposedly shows it. But if you get people who actually understand the math to actually analyze it, then they will point out the errors in the analysis, and they'll point out that it doesn't actually show what he has shown. But the problem with that is then it becomes this issue of dueling experts, because regardless of what you say, the average person is still not going to understand the math behind these things. And this is a problem I have with all kinds of conspiracy theories and strange claims, is that people defer to authority, which is kind of odd, really, because a lot of the people who are conspiracy theorists are anti-authority. But when they find someone who has a little bit of authority that they think agrees with them, then they latch onto that person and say, this person must be right because he is on my side. So that's been
confirmation bias, right?
Yeah, it's confirmation bias, and it's kind of selective argument from authority. People are trying to find authorities that agree with them. And here you've got huge forces on either side of the argument. Many millions of people believe that the election was rigged in Biden's favor, and many millions of people believe these essentially ridiculous claims of statistical analysis of statistical abnormalities, when the actual reality is usually far more complicated than what the guy doing the analysis says, and there's underlying factors which cause the graph to go up or down or things like that, or they simply do the analysis wrong. But because there's so many people pushing these narratives, it's a lot harder to debunk than it is something where it's a fringe subject, like chemtrails or something like that, where it really, the vast majority of scientists and experts think that it's complete nonsense. Here, you can actually get people who will, attempt to argue one thing, and if you can afford to hire lawyers, which of course the Trump campaign can, then they will make very persuasive sounding arguments, because that's their job, is to make a very persuasive sounding argument. You don't get high-priced lawyers arguing that chemtrails are real, and you don't get high-priced lawyers explaining that that 9/11 was an inside job and it was controlled demolition. Nor do you get news outlets, huge numbers of news outlets that are on one side of the argument pushing a certain narrative, and then a number of news outlets on the other side pushing back. So it's a very different dynamic, with it being played out on a much wider battlefield with much bigger players. And I'm just a little player in this. I look at these like a small bit of it. And then there's all these other news organizations, and they're doing things as well, but then they're kind of scattershot, and then they don't always get their information to the right people, and then it becomes lost. So there's another challenge there, is simply taking the information that these other news organizations do and trying to get it to the right place.
So then what is a person to do who's out there? Let's say they're middle of the road. They're not swayed one way or the other on this topic. What's one thing they can do to try to have a better chance of arriving at the truth?
I think people need to look at multiple sources. And even if you start out thinking that the other side has it all wrong, like say you're a liberal and you think that everything that's on Fox News is wrong, or that everything on even One American News Network is wrong, it's worthwhile looking at what they're saying, because if you think they're wrong, you need to understand what it is actually that they're saying that is wrong, and try to understand why they're saying it and get a broader context. So look at more than one news outlet. Don't just look at one outlet and read their articles. Read it from both sides and in different levels of reliability. This is something you can kind of look up. There's a site, I think the media bias chart is a site. I can't remember the exact URL, but it's got this nice little chart where it shows left and right and then degrees of reliability. So you look up where the news outlet falls on that. Is it considered to be very fact-based, or is it considered to be very biased? And if you find yourself, you're looking at just like one bottom corner down here, which is very either left or right-wing bias and very low quality, then perhaps you deserve it for yourself to actually look at other sources. So, take a look at CNN, take a look at Fox News, and then take a look at The Economist, take a look at the BBC, take a look. And then not just that, not just the media outlets, you want to also check the fact-checking sites, and you want to check Wikipedia. Now, people laugh at that because they say, like, these sites are just run by George Soros or whatever. But you can go to these sites, these fact-checking sites, and you don't have to take the fact-checking site's word for it. You can look at the references they give and check what they are saying. You can verify every single thing that is said in these articles for the most part. And so don't view the fact-checking sites as being an authority. View them as a resource that gives you pointers to areas that you can research. So it'll give you a bunch of things that it's saying, like, we found this claim by Donald Trump to be false, and then it'll say, here's why, and then they'll quote some person. This election official said this, and you can go and check to see, did this election official actually say this? And you can go and check the other things that they say, and you can do more research around these things. So you don't have to trust everything they say, just use them as a useful way of looking things up.
And is there a specific fact-checking site you have found, in your opinion, that's more neutral? Have you found any that are clearly biased in one direction or the other?
Well, I think it varies. Some sites, we know that there's a liberal bent behind the sites.
For example?
Probably some sites. Well, Snopes, for example, we know that the people who run Snopes are liberals, essentially. But that doesn't really actually detract from their fact-checking. If you look at the actual articles, they take great pains to be neutral in factual. So they actually look up things and give references to them. They don't just say, oh, we think this is false because of this. But, it might be perhaps that they focus more on one type of claim than another. Perhaps they do, say that this side is doing more fraud than the other. But this is where you need to look at more than one site. If you start to doubt that a site like Snopes is entirely unbiased, and no site really is, then go to the AP, the Associated Press, which is a site that a few years ago I'm sure people would think is neutral, but now people are increasingly polarized. Go to PolitiFact. It's a site that people would accuse of having a left-wing bias, but it also does the same thing. It gives references. Go to factcheck.org, and another thing you can do, which is perhaps the best place to start with election-related things, is to just use Google. Type in your question into Google and see what comes up. Because there's so many different media outlets now focusing on this issue, because it's this huge, very, very important issue that everybody's really interested in. There's a lot of articles on these claims. So you can type up something like, I don't know, whatever it is, 2,600 votes found in Georgia into Google, if that was an actual story. And you will get probably like 4 or 5 at least different articles that discuss that particular claim. And if you do a more extreme claim like millions of ballots forged or whatever the claim is, you could just take one of Donald Trump's tweets and you could type in the text of that tweet and see what comes up. Then you will get links to things like Snopes and PolitiFact and factcheck.org and Fox News and the BBC and other places where people have done investigations. So then you can start looking at these different sources. It's not like they're all like working together. You can tell there are a bunch of different people doing these things, and they often have very different explanations. Mm-hmm. Not different factually, but they're different focuses written by different people. So look at multiple sources. Use Google to do it.
If someone didn't have a lot of time, is there one fact-checking site you could name that you feel would be a good place for someone to start?
If you don't have a lot of time, just go to Google and click on the first link that comes up. Because the other fact-checking sites, you go to them and then you've got to find the thing, and they all have different like search engines. Sometimes they have articles that are like 20 things that are wrong about the election. And so if you really don't have a lot of time, the best thing to do is to use the power of Google to help find what you're looking for. If you want to spend the time yourself, then that's fine. Yeah, you can look at other sites, but Google's the best place to start. And I suppose if you, it really does vary, because every site doesn't cover every single claim. So you might have a particular claim you want to look into, and if you don't have a lot of time, and then you go to Snopes and you spend 10 minutes looking around for it, then you might be disheartened and then give up and think that, oh, this hasn't been debunked because there's no article on Snopes or whatever site you're looking at. So start with Google.
Good point. Hey, Mick, can you do me a favor? Can you move the mic a little bit more direct in front of you, if that's possible?
Let's see. It doesn't really. Let's try that. I'm going to make it pointing at me.
Okay.
I can increase the gain a little.
Okay.
So I'm still quiet. That's a bit odd.
A little bit.
Let me just check. I'm actually on the right. I'm on the right microphone.
It's just when you face directly, you're a little quiet, and when you face a little bit more to the mic, you get a little louder. I actually
I'll try
did exactly.
to keep it.
Yeah, I actually did the same thing last week during an interview.
Okay.
So let's move on to another very relevant conspiracy going on right now, and that is that masks are bullshit. They don't help. They actually spread the virus more than not using a mask. Mm-hmm. It's kind of funny. My dentist, who I respect a lot, and I think is a very smart person in a lot of ways, he's completely convinced of this. And although I get the Johns Hopkins email updates on COVID, and I read repeatedly that across multiple countries, when a country lets down their mask requirements, COVID goes up. And when countries raise their mask requirements, COVID goes down. What have you found is the truth around this?
The same as you, basically. I mean, there's a lot of scientific consensus that masks do good. And it's interesting you bring up the dentist, because I think the most obvious thing that people should think about is if masks don't work, then why do doctors wear them? Why does your dentist wear a mask when he's treating you? And why do all these health professionals wear masks when they're dealing with infected people? That's not to stop the doctors from infecting you either. It's to stop you infecting the doctor. So masks work, and they work in both directions. They work very, very well for stopping the spread of the virus. There was a case, it's several months ago now, of a hairdresser, a hairstylist, who had COVID. She didn't know it for several days, and she cut the hair of, I think, something like 50 people over the course of a week or so. And none of them caught it from her because they were both wearing masks. So, it's just an anecdotal evidence, but you can extrapolate that to all the other people. Where in situations where there's been mass spreading events, like, for example, at the White House, people were not wearing masks. If everybody had been wearing masks at that big presentation, I think it was when the judge was confirmed, the Supreme Court justice was confirmed, people were walking around without masks. If they'd all been wearing masks, the amount of people in the White House who had caught the coronavirus would have been far smaller. But, like you say, there are statistics that show that it does actually help. And it should be fairly obvious when you think about it that it's going to help. And I think that Trump has done some damage there by kind of belittling the usage of masks and doing things like, dramatically taking his mask off when he was standing on the balcony of the White House. And a lot of people prefer not to wear masks, or they don't like them and they feel embarrassed wearing them. I mean, I still feel kind of embarrassed when I go to the store and you have to put this mask on, even when everybody else is wearing them. It's not a fun thing to do. So people have this mental push. And if someone offers them a glimmer of hope that masks aren't actually necessary, they're going to take it. And especially if it then becomes a political thing where they say, oh, it's just something that the liberals are trying to fool us. And, it becomes almost a political statement to not wear a mask, which is ridiculous, really, because you're risking your own life for some kind of political statement. But they don't think of it like that.
Oh God, so many questions. Okay, so one of them is, so besides the Johns Hopkins emails that I get about countries using masks and not using masks, and besides the anecdotal stuff you talked about, is there some evidence? Because obviously when we're thinking about things scientifically or skeptically, we want to focus on evidence. Is there a piece of evidence that you're familiar with, sort of widespread, a large sample size, that really strongly suggests that wearing masks are effective for slowing the spread of COVID?
Well, yeah. The best place to look up those is the CDC. They've got a page which was updated last week. It's called "Scientific Brief: Community Use of Cloth Masks to Control the Spread of SARS-CoV-2 with COVID-19." It's just their name for it. And they list a whole bunch of different studies that have been done in various countries, which reduced transmission of the virus. So that there are these studies. And they've kind of updated their guidance based on this kind of these new studies that have come in. Like before, they were mostly focusing on primary transmission, I guess they call it, where you transmit it to somebody else, and then secondary transmission is where you get it from somebody else. And they say now that there is a very distinct benefit in both directions, and they're basing it upon several new studies. So if you go to the coronavirus page on the CDC, you can look up these studies.
Awesome. So two things. Number one, I wanted to ask you about this anti-science movement and how it got connected to, or maybe just the fact that it's connected, where in a lot of people's minds, in my mind now, it seems like the left is pro-science and the right, at least the far right, is anti-science. And what we can do if we're speaking to someone, and like in your book. So one thing about your book, which I love, the subtitle, "How to Debunk Conspiracy Theories Using Facts, Logic, and Respect." And that respect to me is really important, because it's so easy, no matter what side you're on, to think the other side is dumb. How can they believe these things? Don't they see the truth? And when we come from that place of judgment, I think it's much more difficult to move the conversation closer to truth. Instead, we get in this argument and emotions come up, and it's spinning our wheels. So I think this idea of coming from a place of respect is fantastic. And how do we do that, for example, with someone who is questioning the validity of science?
I think you kind of have to a small degree, acknowledge their concerns, because we talked a bit about real corruption earlier, and we know that institutions are made up of people, and people sometimes either make mistakes or they do bad things, and sometimes they conspire for their own personal good. Sometimes scientists fake results. So there is a small degree of truth to the concerns about the validity of any particular piece of science. But really what science is a very broad institution with everybody kind of essentially fact-checking everybody else. When somebody publishes a result in science, it goes through peer review, which means people check the paper to see that it looks good and check that there's nothing wrong looking with it or wrong with the conclusions. And then it goes to replication. If it's an interesting enough result, other people will try to replicate it. Like if somebody says, we did cold fusion and we did it this way, and here's our results, that's great. But just this one paper, it means nothing. And then so other people will try to replicate it, and they all, they talk to each other, they publish their results, they replicate each other's results, and sometimes it doesn't work out with the replication. So it's not just this one one scientist saying something, which I think it often seems to people. So the challenge is to really, how do you communicate that to people? And when I talk about debunking or this type of conversation, I do it in two senses. One is the spotlight and one is the floodlight. And with the spotlight, you focus on one particular claim. You think, is this thing true or false? Someone makes a claim, for example, about face masks spreading disease. Is this one thing true or false? And so you can kind of debunk that to a degree and say, oh yeah, go look at the CDC page. It's got all these studies on it. Blah blah blah. That might help. It might not. But then there's also the floodlight debunking, which is about supplying people with more context. And people distrust that particular study or whatever it is, not because they've read that study and they think it's bogus, but because they have like a broad distrust of science, which in part comes from a broad lack of understanding and lack of knowledge about how science works. So if you can try to talk to them in broader terms about how science works and how research works and how the peer review process works and how replication works and even how scientific studies like double-blinded studies work, things like that, give them some context as to what's actually behind this one study and all these other studies, then that's a very useful way of kind of moving the needle a little bit towards what we want.
And if you had 60 seconds to explain how science works, I mean, it has to do with testing things, right?
Yeah, well, yes. Science is a process where you observe the world and then you formulate hypotheses, which is kind of, in the vernacular, it's a theory. Scientists use the word theory for something else, but you're theorizing that this might be this because of this. Then you devise experiments to test that hypothesis. And you want to see if you can prove that it is false. You usually can't prove a hypothesis is true, but you can show that it fits, and you can show that you can't disprove it very easily. You can show that it works very, very, very well. So, and then it's published. The results are published. They're examined by other people. They're replicated and tested, and then the cycle kind of continues. Now we've got a scientific theory that explains something, and we go out and we look for other things, and we try to replicate those, and we try to prove those, and we try to just basically increase our understanding of the universe. That's what science is all about, really. It's about understanding why things happen and how to make things happen. And we're just getting better and better and better at it because we've been doing it for a really long time.
And also, I mean, science is our best strategy at arriving at the truth. It's the best thing we've figured out on how to get as close to the truth as we can. And it's not infallible, and theories get revised with new information, right? But if you compare science to, I mean, what's the alternative for coming to conclusions? Emotions or hearsay or feelings, I guess, right?
I would certainly agree with that in the broader context of how humanity figures things out and how scientists figures things out. But regular people are not going to do science. People aren't going to go out and form hypotheses and do experiments and publish peer-reviewed papers. So regular people have to trust science, which is the difficult thing here, in that they don't trust science. And some people perceive science as being part of the institutions that they're essentially fighting against. They see because Dr. Fauci is a scientist and he's telling them to wear a mask, then they see him as being the enemy, and then scientists become the enemy. And then they think, scientists are all just motivated by money, or they're just motivated by getting grants, and all their grants come from the government, or they come from the military industrial complex and things like that. So they denigrate science. But if you could put motivation aside, then yes, the process of science, the actual pure, simple scientific method of observations and hypotheses and experiments and results and publication, that is a really, really good way of figuring out how the universe works. And but the challenge is is showing that process in our institutions is actually free from corruption, which it generally is. But how do you communicate that to people? And I think the way you want to do it is teaching people more about the scientists. The scientists themselves are real people, and they can present their own work. And if someone gives, a scientist themselves gives a little talk on what their actual work is and what the results are and what they did, I think that makes it more approachable. And that's something that I kind of encourage scientists to do. And a lot of them do it, but a lot of them also just publish these kind of opaque papers, which is then left to the media to promote. And then we get into this whole cycle of, who's telling the truth.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's one reason why it's so important. And I agree for scientists and other people to be out in the media making videos like this. So for example, if I read an article by Mick West, I may think, well, he's a skeptic, maybe he's biased in a certain way. But if I start to watch some videos you've put up and I hear your voice and I see your face, that lends some more credibility, because I think, I mean, and nothing's 100%, but I also think as humans, we've evolved to detect lying. And so when we see someone speaking, if they look like they're very credible, does that prove they're credible? No, but it's one more piece of evidence or one more piece of data for us to reflect upon when we're deciding what to believe and how much confidence to put in that belief. And another thing that I've been coming across quite a lot lately, and it circles back to something that you said, cognitive behavioral therapy is something that I have been, it's just been coming up in my life a lot more. In John Haidt's book, The Coddling of the American Mind, he talks about cognitive behavior therapy and specifically cognitive distortions and how they distort our thinking from getting closer to the truth. And I think it's so important for people to, if you have 5 minutes, Google CBT, cognitive behavior therapy. Look at these cognitive distortions, because everybody basically is susceptible to these distortions. And one of the things, we were talking about science, right? So one of the distortions is succumbing to all or nothing thinking, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people, when they view science, it's all or nothing. Oh, it's science, therefore we should believe 100% of what every single scientist says because they can never be wrong. Or on the other side, science is a bunch of bullshit. It's all, the system or money involved and stuff. So therefore you can't believe anything that any scientist says. Both of those extremes are wrong and not very wise to believe, right? We should give definitely some strong value to science because of just how it works, but obviously don't believe everything that every scientist says, and don't throw out everything that science says. Yeah. What's your response to that?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The all or nothing thing is a problem because the world is very, very complicated, and people need to know how complicated it is before they start making these broad, sweeping generalizations. Like science, I think people start to just think of science as just being some guy in an ivory tower telling them to wear a mask, and they don't even think about what else science does. Like science is the underpinning of Western civilization. Everything we have now, we're talking to each other over this magic telephone with pictures right now, and I've got all kinds of wonderful things on my desk that would be impossible without science. Even like the material science of the shackle on this padlock is a product of science. No one really argues about the tensile strength of steel coming from a scientific background, but this is the things that science gives us are things that allow our everyday life to work. Your dentist, the stuff he does is scientifically based. The treatments that you get from the doctor are all scientifically based. So people need to look at science in a broader context and not just in the context of the one little issue that they have right now. Like, all scientists in the entire world are not focusing on trying to make you wear a mask or trying to focus on you having a vaccine. And if you look at this broader context of science and the great things that it can do, I mean, you mentioned cognitive behavioral therapy, which is something that's, I found very interesting for a long time, because it's a way of modifying your own behavior. And things like psychology are difficult to talk about in a scientific context, because humans are very not very repeatable, so it's very difficult to do scientific experiments. But certainly there's science behind that as well. There's science behind a lot of psychological things. But yeah, I think you're correct in that people have this narrow view of things, and if you can help, if you're talking to a friend, if you can help broaden their perspective of that by discussing other things that science does, rather than the one bugbear that they have, then it can be very helpful.
Yeah, and the example that comes to mind is when you go to a hospital, if you have a surgery, would you prefer for the doctor to wash their hands? Well, up until 150 years ago, doctors didn't wash their hands. In fact, the idea was that it's good for doctors not to wash their hands. I forgot exactly what the reasoning was. Maybe it helps your body fight the germs. I don't know. And then I read this book on, which I recommended in the podcast, on President Garfield. And that was one of the key events that helped to promote germ theory. Germ theory had come out before he had gotten shot, but it was controversial, and a lot of people didn't agree it, because they're like, germs? You can't see germs. You can't see with the naked eye. They don't exist. This is just a bunch of bullshit. But a lot of doctors said, yes, germs are actually real. President got shot. Doctors wrote letters into the president's doctors trying to get them to wash your hands before you're digging around to get this bullet out. The president's doctors did not believe it. And the president, spoiler alert, if you're going to read the book, ended up dying basically from an infection from the doctors sticking their hands into his body to remove the bullet. It wasn't the bullet that killed him. It was the infection from the washing of the hands.
Yeah. No, it can be quite astonishing, the advances that science has made on society that we don't even think about. I mean, one thing is agriculture. We were talking about agriculture at the start, feed additives and things like that. The productivity of land in terms of how much food you can get out of a plot of land is something like 10 times what it used to be 100 or 200 years ago, just because of advances in science. And these are actual scientists at universities who research what is the best way of getting higher crop yields. And there's some people who have made such great contributions to this that people theorize, if this guy hadn't been around and come up with this method of improving it, then we would have, millions more people would have died in the last famines of whatever country it was. So there are huge advantages and huge advances that are being made by science all the time. And pointing these out, I think, is a good thing, because there's so much demonization of science that we need to point out that there are heroes in science, people who are essentially like allowing life to be as it is now. Even things like antibiotics. Oops, let me just close this door.
Sure.
Wife just came back.
Sure.
Yeah, antibiotics. Similar type of thing to washing your hands. Antibiotics have saved so many millions of lives. There are infections now that would have been a death sentence before the invention of antibiotics, and now you get whatever the infection is. You go to the doctor, he gives you some amoxicillin, and then a week later you're fine. 100 years ago, a week later you'd be dead.
Exactly. And I want to reiterate something you said before. It's the same thing that Michael Shermer said when he was on the show. And it's just sort of common sense, is because I can imagine in my head, maybe there's a person out there that is anti-science right now, and you're talking about washing the hands, and they're going to say, well, no, because you don't want to wash your hands. You actually do want the germs in your hands because it builds up your immune system, et cetera, et cetera. The the wise thing to do, which is what you said before, is look at both sides. So if you're getting all your information from conspiracy websites, go to your website, get some information there, and then try to balance the two and try to come to a more of a just actually at that point, then you decide for yourself where the evidence sort of pulls you. I want to switch gears though. Did you have something you wanted to say?
Well, just on that, I think there's a fallacy that kind of arises from that. Like people will say, oh, the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. In a lot of situations, the truth is not in the middle. It's one or the other. And so trying to find some middle ground isn't always the best approach. You need to be open to the possibility that one side could be entirely wrong and the other side could be entirely, if not, maybe 99% right. So don't go searching for the middle ground when it doesn't really exist.
Okay, so that's a good point, right? Okay, so how do we? So at the same time, though, we don't want to arrive at a place where we're, let's say, with science, believing science 100% and believing that everything that every scientist has ever said is God's truth, right? So how do we apply that so that it seems like that applies best? And when you're looking at a specific claim,
Yeah, definitely.
Then that's right. It's either, it's going to be either you're going to have a very high degree of confidence in it or you're not, right?
Well, I was involved in a study of chemtrails a while ago. The belief that the trails behind planes are being sprayed by the government, and we asked a whole bunch of scientists if the evidence that for chemtrails actually indicated chemtrails, and basically they all said no. However, you can find one scientist who will say, yes, it is. If you go looking hard enough, you'll be able to find a scientist who believes in chemtrails. So you get this thing called false balance, where you have a very, very small fringe, and then you have a very, very large mainstream. And yet people say, oh, you have to listen to both sides, as if it's 50-50. Now, sometimes there is a grain of truth in what people are saying. Maybe this scientist is concerned about aircraft emissions or something like that. Maybe there's something going on there. But if you're looking at a specific claim, like is the government secretly spraying us with toxic chemicals, and 99.99% of scientists say no, and 0.001% say yes, then it seems unlikely that the truth is somewhere in the middle. So you've got to look at it. Is there a genuine debate here? Is there a genuine uncertainty here? And don't try to create a middle where there isn't actually the one there.
Very good point. Very good point. Okay, so I want to shift gears now to a different topic, something that I'm very much interested in, and that's UFOs. Okay. So I had Michael Shermer on the show a little while back, and we talked about UFOs, and I was a little disappointed that I didn't push him further on a couple of points. And so I'm going to commit to myself not to make that mistake. And I'm going to intend to push a little further with you on this to help further this conversation toward the truth. And so part of the context is on Joe Rogan's show, he had Commander Fravor come on, talk for a couple hours. He also had Bob Lazar come on, talk for a couple hours. If people are interested in those videos, you can check out Rogan's podcast. If we let's put to the side for a second Bob Lazar, and let's focus on Fravor a little bit. Videos came out. So Commander Fravor, U.S. Navy Top Gun instructor, 16 years experience, flying off the coast of San Diego. About 20 years ago, something like that. Or a little bit less.
Yeah, it's 2000, a bit less. It's 2004, I think.
Right. So the way he describes it in a nutshell, they found these anomalous things on the radar coming down from a very high altitude, from above where the radar starts, all the way down to very low altitude above the ocean. He and another plane went out to look at it. Showed on the radar, showed on their video. They perceived it with their eyes. they followed it around for about 5 minutes or so, and then it took off at an incredible speed. That's their claims. The government, U.S. government, came out, has made this video and other similar videos public knowledge, which I think is interesting. You came out with a video on your site, looking critically at the video and making some claims that perhaps this was not a UFO, but it was an artifact of the basically of the equipment. And I know that's oversimplifying what you said, but if people are interested, I'll definitely have a link to your videos, because you made actual multiple videos on this, which I think is great. And I want to thank you for taking the time to actually make those videos. It's always good to get more, get a critical eye on things like this. So the disappointing part for me, the part where I was a little disappointed, had nothing to do with what you did, but it's something that Lex, I think it's Fridman, talked about when he was interviewing Fravor on his show about a month ago, was that it seems like you guys are, and typically this is what happens, people are talking over one another, right? So Commander Fravor comes out with this interview. You come out with videos kind of debunking what he said. He comes out with a response to what you're saying, and it just seems like people are kind of talking over one another. My fantasy is to have both of you guys on this show and to actually be able to, in real time, talk civilly and critically to each other's claims to actually make progress. Because this whole idea of having a one-sided conversation like we're having now, right? It certainly is better than nothing, but in my opinion, it's not even close to actually having both sides live on an actual conversation where you can actually try to make progress towards some of these claims and counterclaims.
Well, I'd be happy to do that, but there's a couple of issues with that. The first one is that the stuff I've been doing is largely visual and to a certain degree like mathematical and analytical. And it's not really something you could just kind of discuss on, certainly not on an audio-only podcast, and come to some resolution. For example, there's what I look at isn't looking at the videos and saying, yeah, this is what this is, absolutely, I figured it out, because I haven't. I don't actually know what these videos show. What I look at is I look at these videos and I look at what other people have said about these videos, claims that people have made. And people have made some claims about these videos that essentially can only be explained by a super advanced technology, which we don't possess, so it seems likely it's aliens. So if these claims are true about the video, then there's something amazing going on. So I look at these individual claims. And just to clarify, there's 3 videos. Only the first one has to do with Commander Fravor. There's the Fleur 1 video. There's 2 others, the Gimbal video and the Go Fast video. They were from something like 10 years later, completely different incident. So this one video that Fravor was talking about that was filmed like an hour or so after he had his encounter. There's a portion of the video right at the end where it looks like the object flies off very rapidly. And if you do the math on that object, if it was actually flying off, it would be doing something like 70 Gs, 70 times force of gravity, G forces, which is something that's beyond any human capability right now. To have a craft that's in space suddenly go boop and disappear off at 70 Gs is, literally like, it's just beyond anything that we've had or even is vaguely on the drawing board. So it would have to be a quantum leap in terms of technology. So it would in fact be an amazing thing. So I look at that claim. I don't look at the video and say like, this is absolutely what it was. I have some theories about what it might be, but if it's extraordinary, then it's very hard to figure out what it is. But is it actually extraordinary? So I look at that and I analyze the video, and what I figured out, I think, is that the movement of the craft is actually the movement of the camera. The camera is tracking the object, and then because the guy taking the video, Chad Underwood, the pilot, because he's constantly cycling through these different views, which involves physical changes within the camera itself, it loses lock in between these things and has to reacquire lock. And you see this in the video, the bars widen, and then it regains the lock, and then it comes back and it starts tracking it again. And then the very last time, and it has to be the last time, it doesn't manage to regain the lock. And so the camera stops tracking. And because the camera has been tracking from left to right the whole time, and it stops, the object just keeps moving in exactly the same speed it was moving before. It doesn't accelerate at all. It's moving at exactly the same speed that it does before. And I did quite a detailed analysis of this. I went through the video frame by frame. I looked at every single camera transition and every single time the object moved. And I showed that there's a correlation between a camera transition and losing lock. There's also a correlation between the angle of the camera, because it shows you the angle at the top of the screen. It says 5 degrees left, 6 degrees left, 7 degrees left. So we know it's tracking to the left. We know that the camera is actually moving at a fairly constant rate. There's a correlation between that rate and the rate at which the object moves, the rate and direction at which the object moves when locking is lost. So if a camera's tracking something and it loses lock and the object moves at exactly the same angular rate in the direction the camera was moving, that kind of indicates that it's the camera that's doing the apparent movement and not the object itself. But then the problem is, and the second problem here is that people don't like that explanation. And because I'm just some guy, I used to be a video game programmer. I don't have any super experience in analyzing fighter jet videos or anything to do with that. The biggest plane I've flown is a Piper, Cherokee Piper, and I don't get any respect. Not that I'm demanding respect here, but I'm just saying it's a problem. So Fravor, because he's a fighter pilot, he thinks, oh yeah, I'm not going to listen to this Mick West. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And this is essentially what he said on the Lex Fridman show, is that he has 15 years as a fighter pilot. So why should he listen to anything I've got to say? And so he didn't actually address the analysis that I did. He just said, oh yeah, it moves really fast at the end. He didn't say how he knew this, other than saying he has 15 years experience as a fighter pilot. He didn't address any of the analysis I did about how it all correlates with the loss of lock. So the issue of getting me and him together to talk about this is that really we would have to sit down, and we would have to sit down in an air of mutual respect. Now, I respect him, but I don't think he respects me. And we'd also have to sit down with the video and be able to frame by frame the video and look at what's actually going on and discuss these little quirks within the video and see what's happening. And that will be a bit of a challenge, but I'd certainly be up for it.
Right. Yeah. And I was thinking actually the same thing, that with certain of the claims, you would have to have the visual and going over frame by frame. I do think that whether it's the two of you or two of anybody, when you get two people on a call together, I think that, now I could be wrong, but at least in this case, it seems to me like it increases the chance of mutual respect. So for example, it's easy for Fravor to come off as kind of dissing you a little bit, like, you don't know what you're talking about. I got 16 years experience in the Navy, right? And so to sort of, be biased against whatever you're going to say. Just my intuition is, we get you two on a call. Now there's actually live human connection going on. I think it's a little bit of less of a bias to be sort of negative toward the other side. I could be wrong, but that's what my gut is telling me.
You'd hope so. It certainly does happen when you get people face to face. I think people in the same room, especially. That works really well, although that's not going to happen with COVID. But people are much more polite to each other, I think, in person or even in a Zoom meeting than they are when they're just talking about each other to somebody else.
Oh, for sure, yeah. Yeah, that's what internet trolling, right? You're never going to see the person, so these people are saying crazy things, horrible things online. Would they say the same thing face to face? I'd say probably most of them wouldn't, because they do.
Yeah, I know. I wouldn't say Commander Fravor has been particularly mean to me or anything like that. He's just been a bit dismissive. That's all. Right.
Exactly. But one of the things, so for example, that could be straightened out without looking at video so much is one of the claims you made in one of the videos was that the gimbal, which is gimbal, it's basically like it's the rotating thing where the camera is, right?
Yeah, gimbal just means the mount of the camera.
Right.
And when you have a gimbal, you have one mount within another mount, so that can rotate, and then there's something within that rotates. So you see it on a little, I think I have one here, just a pan tilt zoom camera.
Right, yeah.
Because it rotates up and down and left to right. So it's gimbal mounted.
Right. So one of the claims you made in one of the videos was that Fravor was saying that it would continue to rotate basically without interruption. And you were saying, no, it doesn't work that way. It would actually have to go around. And that Commander Fravor was perhaps getting this confused with a helicopter.
Yeah, I don't think that probably wasn't it. I think it was what he was talking about there is when you track something that goes underneath the plane. When you're facing forward and you're tracking down, the horizon is up direction is that way, but eventually the horizon is on the other side, so you have to do a flip. So I think that's what he's talking about. But what I was talking about is when you're panning left to right and you cross over the forward axis of the plane, the camera has to do a gimbal correction because it's only a 2-axis gimbal. So it has this gimbal lock. It's kind of difficult to explain, but you can look at the videos. But this is the simplest rebuttal to his argument that it doesn't happen, is that you can actually see it happening in that video, in the FLIR 1 video. I think it's like about a minute in or so. And you see the entire scene rotate as I think it's about, 3 degrees left, something like that. You see the whole thing rotate, and it's doing it because of this gimbal correction. And it's not just that. You can look at the patents for the FLIR system, the system they're using, and it talks about having to do this course correction. By course, I mean rough correction of the gimbal system, because it has this. It's a complicated system. It has these internal gimbal system of mirrors, which you don't usually think of as being a gimbal system, but it's the same thing essentially. It's little rotating mirrors that it uses to keep the image upright. And then it's got the outer housing, which is this big heavy ball on the end of this big torpedo-like structure that's on the underneath of the wing. And it can rotate in 2 ways. The ball can rotate up and down, or the whole thing can rotate around its axis, but that's like 20 pounds of metal having to rotate, so they avoid doing it as much as possible. But when it goes past 0 degrees, because of the gimbal lock, it has to do a rotation. And you see this in the video. You see this big rotation of the whole field of light, which is caused by the housing rotating and the way the sun hits the housing. The image doesn't really rotate because you don't want it to rotate. It's derotated internally, but you see this rotation of the light field. So, I would just, if he thinks it doesn't happen, then explain why it appears to happen in that video.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because for him, with his experience, to be wrong about something that seems so basic like that, that's a big claim, and that's why it'd be so interesting to hear him explain it.
Yeah, he's looking at it from an inside perspective. So he's talking about what he personally experiences in the jet. So he would experience this thing where you track down to follow something, it has to do a rotation to keep the horizon up as it goes underneath the plane. Yeah, that's true. But he doesn't fly outside the plane and look at what the camera is actually doing. He just gets the visuals from the inside. So his perspective doesn't actually encompass what's going on under the hood. Sure, he has some degree of understanding of what's going on, but he's not the systems engineer. He's not the mechanic who maintains these things. He's just the guy who uses it. So even though he knows a lot about it, he doesn't necessarily know exactly how the ball on the end of the torpedo, the FLIR system, is actually moving when certain things appear on the screen.
But wouldn't he know? I mean, you know. Well, you know.
I do now. I do now because I spent years looking into it. Right. But he's a pilot who's very, very good at flying the plane, and he's probably very good at using the FLIR system to track things on the ground. But he doesn't need to know how the mirrors inside the thing work, how the derotation mechanism works, how the laser beam is collimated, and how the feedback is aligned to make the laser targeting system all work. He doesn't need to know how it works to a fine-grained level. He just needs to know how to use it. He needs, to a small degree, that involves understanding what's going on. But race car drivers don't understand everything about their race cars. Fighter jets don't understand everything about their planes. Talk to the mechanics who maintain them, and fighter pilots will say, "Oh, I have this problem with the plane," and it comes down sometimes just to a misunderstanding as to how the plane actually works.
Right. This all points to another reason why we got to get you guys on a call to to move some of this forward. Do you have another 5 minutes or so? I know we're at the top of the hour.
Sure. Yeah. That's
okay. Cool. So on the same topic, the fact is that we don't just have the video. We also have not just eyewitness testimony of Commander Fravor, but also of the other pilot, and maybe also their navigation person, their person on the back seat. I'm not sure if all 4 people saw this with their eyes or just 2 of them. But we have not just the video, but also eyewitness accounts. Not just eyewitness accounts, but eyewitness accounts of people who are trained to observe these sorts of things. Now, are they infallible? Of course not. They're human. Everyone can make mistakes. But wouldn't you agree, though, that it, as compared to just having the video alone, when you have multiple eyewitnesses seeing something that, and they're trained, does it prove that what they saw is true? No. But does it increase the likelihood? Is it a significant piece of evidence that needs to be part of the whole conversation? I would imagine yes. What are your thoughts on that?
It would be huge if that's what actually happened. But when we're talking about the video, we actually do just have the video. There are no eyewitnesses to what was in that video. Nobody actually saw the object as it was being filmed. No one was there in the area whilst that video was occurring. So if you're just looking at the video, Commander Fravor saw something an hour earlier. The radar stuff happened in the days before that. What Chad Underwood, the pilot who took the video, he didn't see it with his naked eyes. He had a radar hit. He pointed the camera in the direction of the radar hit, and he picked up something on the camera. And then we have that video. So we don't have any eyewitnesses about what was in that video. We have eyewitnesses about something else, possibly the same thing, but we have no idea if it was the same thing. It doesn't move in the same way that was described by Commander Fravor. Commander Fravor says it was like ping-ponging and then zipping away. It doesn't move like the radar returns that we saw, which were things dropping down from outer space to sea level. It doesn't do that. It's just a relatively slowly moving thing off in the distance, which is roughly consistent with a distant plane flying off away to the left. But yeah, eyewitnesses would be great if we had an eyewitness to something that was videoed as well, but we don't. We have eyewitnesses to something else.
Wait, so you're saying that Fravor's eyewitness account happened an hour before the video was recorded?
Yeah. He was flying and he got vectored to a certain position. He flew there and he saw like a disturbance in the water. He looked down. There was another plane that was higher up. They looked down. They both saw some kind of white object. Their initial descriptions of what they saw are kind of different. The top cover pilot, the higher pilot, described something moving very rapidly in a straight line, which the first thing that she described was something moving very rapidly in a straight line from one side of this area to another. And Fravor described it as hovering in front of this object and then kind of moving like a ping pong ball or bouncing off the sides of a barrel. And then he describes how he moved down. She describes this as well, but you can't really line up their accounts and say that they match. It sounds like they're describing something similar viewed from very different angles. And maybe I think that's what's happened. But to the point, they had this encounter, and they saw something. I'm sure there was some white object there that they all saw. I don't know what it was. Then they flew back to the plane.
Actually, the
Commander
carrier,
Fravor,
you mean?
yeah, flew back to the aircraft carrier, and Chad Underwood actually spoke to Fravor before he took off, and Fravor said, "Be on the lookout, BOLO, whatever the acronym was." And Underwood took off, and a bit later he got a ping, and he took this video. So they're completely separate things.
Interesting. Okay, because I thought didn't Fravor have the eyewitness account of the thing going like this and whoosh, and flying off so fast?
Yeah, no, that's from his encounter. So he said that he saw he saw this thing, and then he flew down to look at it, and he circled it, and then he flew towards it, and it flew past him. So that's his account. I think the most likely thing that happened there is that it was some kind of white featureless object, like a balloon, and he basically had a lack of spatial awareness, which he will vehemently deny because he's a 15-year veteran pilot who knows exactly what he's doing and has never made mistakes in his life.
Okay, that's not fair. Yeah, that's not fair.
It was let me address that in a second. But my theory as to what happened is that he thought it was basically twice as far away as it actually was. And so, if you think about that in terms of his description of what happened, it makes perfect sense because he describes him coming down to it and then it coming back up to him, this symmetrical thing. Then he describes he is going around the circle and it's going around the other side of the circle. But it would look exactly the same if it was stationary in the middle of the circle and he was going around it. But he thought it was over here. Then he describes going towards it. He thinks it's over here and he's going towards it. But if it was over here and he goes towards it, it would look like it was accelerating really fast past him. So I think that's the most likely thing that explains it. After that, we have other possibilities. It might be some kind of hypersonic drone or something. Who knows? Could be an alien spaceship. But to the point of I kind of I don't know, caricatured his reaction there. But if you look at his talk with Lex Fridman, it's very interesting because he talks about how he knows he saw what he saw, and he says 15 years experience. And he literally says that as being the reason that he knows he saw what he saw. And then Lex asks him, how often do people make mistakes? And he said, people make mistakes all the time. In fact, we're trained not to trust our own eyes because the human visual system makes these mistakes. And what you see isn't what's actually out there, which was this weird disconnect between what he was saying earlier. He knew 100% what he saw, well, 99.9%, I think he said, because he's got so much experience, and that people make mistakes all the time and that they're trained to ignore what their eyes are telling them and trust in other things instead. So I would kind of follow up on that if you ever talk to him.
Well, hopefully we'll both be able to talk to him. And I think where he was coming from with that was that they're trained not just to believe what they see with their eyes, but to corroborate it with their instruments. I think that's what he would say, but we won't know until we talk to him. So, well,
I think he was quite clear actually that he was saying that sometimes what you see with your eyes or what you feel or think is entirely wrong. It's not just that you look and then you check to see if it's right. Sometimes your eyes completely fool you, and you do make mistakes. People make mistakes where they think the plane is one way up when they're actually upside down. And they will do things like, there's a famous incident from many years ago when a fighter pilot flew into the ground because he thought he was the right way up when he was upside down. People do make mistakes. There's a huge, if you look in the Navy manuals for pilots, they talk about all these different situational awareness mistakes that people make. And Fravor knows this, and he's had training in these specific things. And he describes one training thing that they do, where they put them in some kind of graviton or something and spin them around, so that they don't know which way is up, and they get really confused as to which way is up. So these mistakes do happen where you are entirely fooled by your senses. So it's not just simply a matter of corroborating; it's a matter of sometimes being wrong.
Right. And Commander Fravor could be wrong. And I think saying that, like the example, the fighter pilot flying into the ground because they were upside down, I think that's a bit of a straw man argument. Because with Fravor, Top Gun, I think he's Top Gun trainer. So not just going to Top Gun, but trains Top Gun pilots. And what they do is they practice dogfights. And when you're dogfighting, you're using your, I'm not a pilot, but I would assume you're using your instruments, but you're also using your eyes quite a bit. And I would imagine they train to
yeah, but
like they'd be the best at it, basically.
Look at the guy who flew into the ground. He was a military pilot. He wasn't just some guy. He was flying like an FA-18, I think, and he did the same thing. Obviously it's an extreme example, and it hardly ever happens. But the fact that he is an instructor who has so much experience can in some ways blind him to his own susceptibility to occasionally make mistakes in very rare circumstances. I think what we had here isn't something that happens very often. It's not like you hear about this all the time. People making this exact same mistake, or this parallax error of thinking something is near or far away. Yeah, there's a simulation video, I think, that was done by, it's called the Nimitz Encounter. It's on YouTube. And if you look at the bit of the video where he is circling around the Tic Tac, and think about, is that Tic Tac moving, or is it stationary and we're just flying around it? I'd encourage people to go and look at that. Because if you look at it and you look at that context, you can see how you could very easily make that mistake if you don't know how big the object actually is. Now, he said it was 40 feet long. It was the size of a hornet, because he's trained to see how big things are. But you can tell how you know how big a hornet is because you know how big a hornet is. If you see a hornet, that's hornet size. And so that allows you to say how far away it is. So if you just assume something is the size of a hornet, then that also means you're making an assumption about how far away it is. If it's actually half the size of a hornet, that means it's actually half the distance towards you. And so if you've made that mistake and you continue to make that mistake, your brain has got no way of correcting for that. You've already locked in on it being a hornet-sized object that's 5 miles away, when it's actually a half hornet-sized object that's 2.5 miles away. And so you're flying around it in this big circle. You think that it's flying around you, but you're just flying around it. It's an understandable mistake. And if that is what happened, I'm not saying it is, it's just a possibility that needs to be looked into, then I think that his years of experience may have worked against him, in that it gave him this unfounded self of confidence in his own perceptions.
Definitely an interesting conversation. And it points to the fact that the truth sometimes is complicated and takes some work to try to get closer to it once you start digging. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Mick, really enjoyed talking to you. Where would people need to go to learn more about your debunking work, and any other resources you think would be great for people to get access to?
The simplest thing is to go to metabunk.org. And you can also find me on Twitter at Mick West, and on YouTube, youtube.com/Mick West will take you there. And there is a playlist that I have on my channel for all the UFO Navy videos. And I've organized them roughly in order of relevance. And so I just start at the top and look at that one. I'll look at any particular case that you're interested in. The first one that comes up will be the most relevant one. And I'm always free to answer questions. You can email me, mick@mickwest.com, ask me something, or just contact me on Twitter. My DMs are open.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mick. Appreciate it.
Thank you.